Welcome to Now You See TV. I'm your host, Jake Grant, and today we are joined by Michael Mize again with Creation Club. And today's topic is design in nature. Is there evidence for God? And so we love having Michael Mize on.
Michael Mize again with
Creation
So
Club.
we got something
and
going
today,
here in the background. Excuse me, guys.
So Michael, welcome to Now You See TV. How are you doing?
Great, really pleased to be back. It's always excited to get to come on and discuss these topics, and love hearing from the chat, and hopefully it'll just be a blessing tonight and be able to affirm people's faith, and as we dig into some of the aspects of our Father's creation and how we can be aware of him and glorify him through what he's made.
Yeah, definitely. And just some really quick house cleaning stuff. Michael Mize is part of nystv.org. He uploads these videos, and I'm just going to screen share real quick. You can go to nystv.org, which is our subscription site, and you can use the promo code Creation Club for 10% off. And we have a lot of awesome stuff here. Here's Creation Club. And this is the latest video. This is the kind of the topic we'll be talking about today with Michael, but it's a very well put together video. And of course, all the other videos he's put together for us, and all the other exclusive content we have. We have Robbie Davidson's new DVD, Scientism Exposed 2. We also have our new documentary, Dark Covenant, Vampires, Lies of the Immortal, and also a ton of other stuff that you guys can check out. If you want to help support Now You See TV, you can subscribe to nystv.org. I think it's like $8 a month. And it's a great way to help our ministry grow. We have a lot of big plans in store. And also, I just want to show anybody who's never been part of the Now You See TV fellowship chat, where we field live questions. You can go to nowyousee.tv.org, click live show, and here at the bottom of the page, you can see the NYSTV family chat. If you join this, I think it takes like Facebook or Twitter or something to log in, and you'll be able to ask questions during the show for whatever topic we're covering during the interview. So that's all that I kind of wanted to show you guys before we get started. And Michael, I'm excited. Let's go ahead and dive into this topic.
Fantastic. I'd love to open us up in prayer as we seek to explore this topic. Father God, we just come before you humbly, and we're just in awe of what you've done. Father, we just want to lift you up and exalt your name and celebrate who you are as our creator, our sustainer, and our redeemer. And Father, I pray tonight that you'd be glorified in our conversations and the topics. I pray that the people that you need to see this would see it, and that it would be a blessing to them. I pray that eyes might be opened, and I pray that you would bless my efforts to just honor and glorify you, and that whatever our conversation leads to, it would be of you. And in the name of your son, Yeshua, we pray. Amen. So I appreciate that, having me back on, and I definitely apologize. I don't know how other folks have been going around the states, but we are getting hammered right now in Kansas with all kinds of illness. I've probably got at the high school where I teach three to four kids out sick just about every single hour of the day, and I'm definitely struggling against some serious congestion here, so I'm going to do my best.
Last week, I was super sick as well, and just now recovered. Thank you for everybody out there who was praying for us. I know it's definitely been a kind of a states-wide thing. I see Rob Skiba posting all over about chemtrails and blaming those for his hacking fits. But just it's awful this flu season, and I know I got sicker than I've been in a long time this past Friday, thanks to everybody who covered the shows last week. But yeah, Michael, we're right along there with you, and we hope you kind of pull through. When you're on the battleground of the school system, you're bound to get all kinds of bugs that are brought in by students, I'm sure.
Oh man, and I've always joked that our home is like a petri dish because both our kids are in public school. So I'm in one public school, my daughter's in a different one, my son's in a different one. My wife's a social worker, and she works in a larger residential care facility. So I mean, we've just got it coming at us from all angles. So I'm feeling pretty good, but I've been battling some congestion. So I'm gonna do my best to not gross everyone out, clearing my throat too much tonight. So we're gonna jump into this and screen share here so that you guys don't get stuck looking at my ugly mug for too long, and we will jump right in. So are you getting that on your end?
Yeah, that's coming in all right.
Awesome. And as always, feel free, Jake, to just jump in wherever you like. But this is a video that I've actually spent quite a bit of time on, probably more on this particular video than any other. So really would encourage people to check it out if they can on Now You See TV. It's just over, I think, 36 minutes long, and got a lot of really great footage. It was a lot of fun to put this video together, and I learned a lot in doing it. So the slideshow tonight will give you a taste of that, and hopefully inspire you to go check out the full video there, and hopefully that would be a blessing to you. But the idea of design has always been of interest to me personally, being that I'm an artist and I've always been interested in science. And design definitely is a multifaceted word. There's a lot of different angles at which we can explore the concept of design. In fact, just Google provides this definition: that purpose, planning, or intention that exists or is thought to exist behind an action, fact, or material object. And interestingly enough, the sentence that they offer is the appearance of design in the universe. So that's their example sentence of how to interpret design. And I thought, leave it to Google to be working in a little evolutionary doctrine in the most unlikely of places as well. But, when we see diagrams like this, the complexity of whatever this mechanical apparatus was, clearly we understand design from an engineering perspective, and the design is evident simply by looking at the mechanical nature and all of the inner working parts that clearly have to function together to achieve whatever purpose this machine might have. The design aspect of that is inherent. And the Father has made it clear in Romans 1 that the same is true for his creation, that he has revealed himself through what he has made. And so if we look at design from an engineering perspective, and we see exactly how the Father has revealed himself through what he has made, it's very easy to appreciate design in nature from this engineering perspective by recognizing the sophisticated array of interconnected biological components. Just the cell, for example, we look at just this diagram of a cell and all of the various parts and systems and very complicated biological systems that all have to have this kind of symbiotic relationship just to make one cell function. And this is a very simple diagram. I mean, there's certainly far greater complexity going on inside the cell. And so it becomes very apparent, especially when we consider that every form of life on Earth, all of the tissue, all of the organs, all of the bones, every aspect of any living creature, all of that is manufactured from the DNA, from this exceedingly complex set of instructions. And it's the arrangement, obviously, of that genetic information that is going to develop into whether it's a human kidney or the hollow bones of a bird, or the structure of a Venus flytrap. Like, all of this is coming from the same complicated set of digital instructions. And to me, that's already case closed as far as evidence for God is the information-bearing molecule. In a article written back actually in 1962, Paul Dottie, he is a Harvard University scientist, was quoted in the article as saying that the cell is as complicated as New York City. And that's a pretty incredible statement to think about. Like, if you stop for a moment, and I don't know, Jake, if you've ever been to New York City or not. but it was.
I would love to go. I think it'd be a cool trip.
Yeah, I've been once, and it was probably one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. But,
well, I grew up in Manila, so I'm not afraid of the big cities with tons and tons of people bumping shoulders with you.
Yeah, having been born and raised in Kansas, like I was the country mouse there, and it sounds cliche to say, but the cab ride from the airport to our hotel definitely ranks in my top 3 most scariest moments. So it was, but you think about New York and just the size of it, and everything that is taking place in New York as far as the traffic and the businesses and how many telephone wires there are in there and how many electrical outlets there are. And I mean, just everything that makes New York City function as a city. And here in 1962, we were recognizing that a single cell is as complicated as that. And that is truly an astonishing statement. And, since 1962, we've only learned more and more about just how complicated each cell is. And so to assume that kind of complexity at that small of a scale could arise out of some cosmic accident and through a series of remarkable coincidences is really just intellectually dishonest. Another great quote here by Peter Gwynne, who was he was an award-winning science writer and editor for Newsweek. Again, in 1979, so this has been a while, in an episode of Newsweek, he was describing the complexity that they knew about in the human cell at that point. He said, each of those 100 trillion cells functions like a walled city. Power plants generate the cell's energy. Factories produce proteins, vital units of chemical commerce. Complex transportation systems guide specific chemicals from point to point within the cell. Sentries monitor the outside world for signs of danger. Disciplined biological armies stand ready to grapple with invaders, and a centralized genetic government maintains order. It's fascinating how much it really does sort of sound like he's describing a city and the way that it functions and the order that is involved in the various kinds of systems and how those systems interplay and interact. And again, this is happening in each of the trillion cells that we all have within our body without us even aware of it. I mean, it's a marvelous kind of creation. That first complex little diagram that we looked at on the first slide pales in comparison to the just overwhelming complexity that we are ourselves as biological machines. And in fact, the idea of design through the concept of, or from the perspective of engineering, only becomes more clear when we understand that biologists today are identifying all kinds of elaborate microscopic structures that they're literally referring to as cellular machines or nanomachines because of their very tiny size. And these sophisticated nano-sized machines often include a great many essential parts that are all engineered together in such a way that it makes it impossible for the structure as a whole to have formed gradually by small incremental changes, which is, of course, the hallmark of the evolutionary worldview, is that things would have started very simple and gradually are becoming more and more complicated over time through the process of the survival of the fittest and adaptation, gradually forming more and more complicated structures as we go. But we're beginning to understand that the level of complexity that we're seeing in the cell, it's simply unrealistic to assume that this could have happened by random processes. It's overwhelming evidence that there is clearly intelligence involved in the way these things function. One of the scientists that's been at the forefront of this research for several years is Michael Behe. And he's written quite a bit on this. Darwin's Black Box is probably one of his most well-known books. And he's developed a concept regarding this fact that he has labeled irreducible complexity. He's actually kind of building on the work of some scientists that came before him as well. And he's written extensively about how this idea of irreducible complexity applies to our understanding of the origins of these cellular machines or these nano machines. A few quotes from him in an article he wrote in the New York Times. He says, "I believe that Darwin's mechanism for evolution doesn't explain much of what is seen under a microscope. Cells are simply too complex to have evolved randomly. Intelligence was required to produce them." And this was again from an article written in the New York Times in 1996. The article goes on to say, excuse me, it goes on to say that Darwin's theory encounters its greatest difficulties when it comes to explaining the development of the cell. Many cellular systems are what I term irreducibly complex. That means that the system needs several components before it can work properly. And the most classic example that he offers in his book of irreducible complexity is the mousetrap. And he explains that a single system, which is composed of several interacting parts that contribute to the basic function, and where the removal of any one of the parts causes the system to effectively stop functioning. And so in this mousetrap example that he has used to demonstrate this, and many of the listeners tonight have probably heard this, is the mousetrap that we're all familiar with. You know, you have the wooden platform, you have a spring, you have the stabilizing rod, you know, you have the bent kill rod, and you have the catch upon which the cheese sits. And so you need all of these components in order for the function of the mousetrap, which catching mice. You need all of those parts in place at the same time. And if you were to lose any one of those parts, then the entire system, the entire tool of the mousetrap would completely lose all function. So you have to have all of them, all the parts, and you have to have all the parts in place at once. And so if we were to find examples of biological, you know, nano machines which would fit this concept where all of the parts need to be in place at once or the system stops functioning, then Behe deems that structure to be irreducibly complex. It means you can't go backwards and try and gradually develop this system one part at a time, as evolution would suggest, because you would never gain function until all of the parts are in place, and natural selection by definition, would have selected against that device when it didn't have any purpose. And so probably the most well-known example that Behe cites in his literature is that of the bacterial flagellum. And I was actually going to play a video clip tonight, but it is in the Design and Nature video on nowuctv.org. It's about a 3 or 4 minute clip from the film put out by Discovery Institute. Oh gosh, and now the name is escaping me. The Secret Life of Cells, or something along that lines. I think I'm getting that wrong, but there's a clip in the
for them to go and check out the stuff you've put together for nystv.org. So
there you go. It's a good reason to free shameless plug there. But the idea of the bacterial flagellum is that, you know, it's the one little whip-like tail that many bacteria have, and it's what allows them to propel through the cellular fluid. And using electron microscopes, they were able to begin to take a close look at this little structure, just the bacterial flagellum themselves, and scientists were stunned to find what is effectively an outboard motor. And the parts that are described in this are the same kind of parts that you would see in a regular outboard motor. It has a drive shaft, it has a hook region, it has a propeller, it has a stator, it has a rotor, it's water cooled. I mean, it is a tiny little motor. And this motor is comprised of over 40 different parts. You know, the mousetrap example of irreducible complexity has just 5 parts. But this little nano-sized outboard motor has over 40 different parts. And you need all of those parts in order for the system to function. If even one of these 40 parts were missing, then the entire system breaks down and loses all function. And so this becomes a remarkable example of that idea of irreducible complexity, because evolution has no description. It has no suggestion of how you could incrementally over time build up to a system like this that is that complicated and that remarkably designed. And so as we look here, this is an article off of the Intelligent Design and Evolution Awareness site. I'm sorry, one second here. And the article in Irreducible Complexity, the challenge to the Darwinian evolutionary explanations of many biochemical structures. And I just wanted to read a few portions of this article because it makes some really incredible points. The first of which is an extraordinary quote by Charles Darwin himself, that he said, "If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down." The article says, with this statement, Charles Darwin provided a criterion by which his theory of evolution could be falsified. The logic was simple. Since evolution is a gradual process in which slight modifications produce advantages for survival, it cannot produce complex structures in a short amount of time. It's a step-by-step process which may gradually build up and modify complex structures, but it cannot produce them suddenly. The article goes on to kind of explain the mousetrap example that we were just discussing, but then it clarifies here and it says, in fact, Michael Behe asserts that the complicated biological structures in a cell exhibit the exact same irreducible complexity that we saw in the mousetrap example. In other words, they are all or nothing. Either everything is there and it works, or something is missing and it doesn't work. As we saw before, such a system cannot be constructed in a gradual manner. It simply won't work until all the components are present. And Darwinism has no mechanism for adding all the components at once. Remember, Darwin's mechanism is one of gradual mutations leading to improved fitness for survival. A less than complete system of this nature simply will not function, and it certainly won't help the organism to survive. Indeed, having a half-formed and hence non-functional system would actually hinder survival and would be selected against. But Behe is not the only scientist to recognize irreducible complexity in nature. In 1986, Michael J. Katz, in his Templates and the Explanation of Complex Patterns, writes, "In the natural world, there are many pattern assembly systems for which there is no simple explanation. There are useful scientific explanations for these complex systems, but the final patterns that they produce are so heterogeneous that they cannot effectively be reduced to smaller or less intricate predecessor components. As I will argue, these patterns are, in a fundamental sense, irreducibly complex." So the idea of trying to take this outboard motor, the bacterial flagellum, and suggest that it could have been sequentially built up slowly over time simply falls apart by Darwin's own definition. I mean, he provided, again, the criteria that could falsify his claim. But really, I think as well, to fully appreciate the staggering complexity of this sophisticated propulsion system, we have to really try and comprehend the infinitesimal scale in which this machine operates. And again, using electron microscopes, scientists have measured the thickness of the cell membrane in which the bacterial flagellum functions, in which it's seated there, to be approximately 8 nanometers thick. And so they're saying here that this outer membrane and the inner membrane, about 4 nanometers apiece. So again, the size of this outboard motor is essentially about 8 nanometers thick. And it's one thing to hear that measurement and to appreciate that, wow, that must be very small. But to try and put it in perspective, there's a great little video here that I think I'm just going to provide the narration for, because I still really want you guys to be able to see this. that is putting into perspective exactly how small a nanometer is. Excuse me. So the naked eye can see the diameter of a human hair, and that is about 1/10 of a millimeter, which is effectively about 100,000 nanometers. And they zoom out so you can see how small that is in comparison to just a centimeter. So if they take that 1/10 of a millimeter and scale it up to the size of the Empire State Building, which is 443 meters, then we can start to appreciate just how small some of these features are. So a red blood cell, for example, rises just to the 10th floor. A regular bacteria cell would rise to the 3rd floor. A simple protein would be about 1.5 feet, and then 1 nanometer compared to the Empire State Building would be less than 1/4 of an inch. So again, we're saying that if a human hair, which we can just barely see the diameter of, if a human hair were the size of the Empire State Building, a nanometer would be about 1/4 inch. So 8 nanometers would be 2 inches compared to the Empire State Building. I mean, that kind of puts in perspective, I hope, the size of this outboard motor. And so again, the idea of design being obvious, when we see an outboard motor like this operating to propel a boat through a body of water, we just inherently understand that that machine is the product of intelligence, right? We instinctively know that the multiple complicated inner working parts were designed, engineered, manufactured, and assembled by intelligent beings. It's painfully obvious. So how much more obvious is it that when we see an outboard motor measuring only 8 nanometers functioning to propel a bacterium through cellular fluid, those multiple complicated inner working parts must have been designed, engineered, manufactured, and assembled by an intelligence far superior to our own, because we can't even begin to fathom building machines at that scale, or at least, to the public's knowledge, we can't. But the point still stands that it simply must be designed, and it's intellectually dishonest to try and suggest otherwise. I'll pause there, Jake, if you've got anything you'd like to jump in and add.
Yeah, I was just being wowed. That is so incredible. Just the size of these tiny little bacteria cells, and just the membrane and all the working parts that have to all be in place for this thing to exist and it to operate. And if one little piece was missing, then it would all collapse. And yeah, I mean, just it's so incredible. And I don't understand how people who believe in the theory of evolution, let me say that again, how they can justify, oh yeah, these things started off with just a few building blocks and then they slowly got more complicated. Well, how did they get to the stage that they're at now? And it's just, it makes you scratch your head. It just very, very interesting. Thank you for showing some of those videos. I was just blown away with some of the stuff that was playing in the background while you were talking about this topic. Just watching these microscopic worlds pretty much operate, and our whole body consists of trillions and trillions of these cells and these bacterium and things on a microscopic level that would freak me out, I'm sure. Just very, very cool.
Yeah, and exactly. And you think about how many functions are going on in your body on any given day, irrespective of your attention. How many things are functioning to keep you alive without you having to intentionally do them. The breath in our lungs, the sight in our eyes, all of these things are outside of our control. And thank goodness, because as distracted as we've become, we would die in less than a minute by just forgetting to breathe. The complexity of this design and the size of it just continues to blow me away. And as I understand it, There are many scientists in the kind of microcellular biology is a fairly fast growing group of Bible believers, because as they continue to do their work and as they just continue to go smaller and smaller and find only more and more complexity, the argument for design becomes irrefutable. It becomes so painfully honest. And again, that goes right back to Romans 1:20. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. There's just no excuse to try and suggest that this is not clearly the product of an infinitely wise creator. So moving on, the bacterial flagellum, however, is only one of a great many irreducibly complex nano-sized machines that scientists have discovered. And there are numerous sophisticated manufacturing processes taking place every minute in every cell that demonstrate design just as clearly. And I do definitely want to give credit here, and I credit these in the video as well. A lot of these animations coming from short films put out by the Discovery Institute, and also The Secret Life of Cells by BioVisions, which is an animation program at Harvard University. And they've put out a very well-renowned animation film that helps people visualize this complexity that we're discovering in the human cell. But for example, one of these is called the ATP synthase enzyme, and it's a microscopic electric rotary motor that is constantly assembling and distributing individual molecules of ATP, which is the primary energy source for fueling all cellular functions. So it is bringing in different molecules that are floating around in the cytoplasm inside the cell. And then, I mean, look at that, look at that thing rotate. It just is remarkable to think that there's a tiny little rotary motors like this that are assembling little chemical components together and spitting them out into the cell. And they're essentially little batteries floating around to help provide the energy needed for all of the various cellular functions that have to go on within a cell. Another remarkable one, really one of my favorites, is the kinesin linear motor protein. And this is a minuscule transportation machine that delivers these very large, in comparison to its size, very large protein bundles by literally walking across the many microtubule pathways linked throughout each cell. And the animations for this are fantastic. And the way that it walks is another mind-bogglingly complex system of electrical impulses and reactions that are happening that cause the 2 feet to step, step, step. And then again, almost like an ant and its enormous strength, the size of these protein bundles in comparison to this little linear motor, I mean, it's pulling a colossal amount of weight compared to its size. Fascinating little structure inside the cell. DNA transcription and translation is a really remarkable process, staggeringly complicated process, in which the detailed instructions that are embedded into the strands of DNA are unwound, decoded, and copied. Then these transcribed instructions are transported through a series of remarkably complex machines that assemble long sequences of individual amino acids into protein chains, which are then folded into these intricately specific shapes. And proteins, of course, are the building blocks for all life. And so the process by which the information is extracted from DNA is again, remarkably complex. It's actually unwinding the DNA, copying it, and it does this at an incredible speed. And then that copy goes out into the cell for protein production. Truly, truly an incredible thing. And then these folded proteins, as we mentioned, become the basic building blocks for all the various biological structures and tissues required of any living organism. Even more fascinating is the fact that a great many of these tiny machines and procedures are interdependent upon one another to function. So each cell is a marvelously engineered symbiotic chemical factory in which all of the moving parts are choreographed to operate together in unison. So the quote that we looked at by Paul Doty from the 1960s, that a cell is as complicated as New York City, we're only now beginning to fully appreciate just how accurate of a statement that truly is. And so it becomes a remarkable testimony to our Father in heaven that true scientific evidence really only ever points you towards the requirements of a creator. In the same way, like to say that a scientist can disprove the existence of God is like saying a mechanic could disprove the existence of Henry Ford. A great meme that is circulating online there, that there was an author, and his name escapes me, that had coined that quote. But I think it's a brilliant point to make, that it's simply improbable to suggest that we could have this kind of complexity going on by random chance and circumstance. But for me as an artist, and this is what truly got me excited about this idea, and I suppose before I change gears, I should probably pause and see, Jake, if you had anything else that you wanted to offer there.
Oh yeah, please continue. Yeah.
Is design from an aesthetic perspective, and this is what truly gets me excited again as an artist myself. One of the other angles of design that we see clearly in the world around us is that of artistic beauty, or just beauty in general, and how that correlates into what has been made. And so another definition of design, these from dictionary.com, is to plan and fashion artistically or skillfully, to plan and fashion the form and structure of an object, work of art, decorative scheme, etc., or the organization or structure of formal elements in a work of art or composition. And so in the same way that the bacterial flagellum and countless other nano-sized cellular machines demonstrate that the Most High is an infinitely wise engineer, his creation also reveals that he is a stunningly skillful artist as well. Perhaps the most conclusive examples of artistic design in nature are found in the numerous examples of animal camouflage and mimicry. And in case you didn't notice it yet already, there is some manner of little rodents hiding here amongst the rocks, and his color and patterning just camouflage him beautifully there into his environment. And so this is an aspect of design that gets me really excited. And this is where, again, I really hope people take the opportunity to watch the video, because this is the aspect of the video that took me so long to put together. As I've got a lot of video footage from several different sources, looking at a number of different examples of animal camouflage and mimicry. So I've got one or two just photos here for the presentation tonight, but I really do hope you take a chance to look at the video, because it's remarkable. And that's not me taking credit for it, because I mean, it's all footage I found online and just put together for educational purposes. It's remarkable in the sense that when we see what our Father has done, it just inspires worship as we marvel at his creation. So one example that I thought was pertinent, especially as we try and present an alternative view to the evolutionary worldview, is that of the peppered moth. And the peppered moth is really an iconic animal from an evolutionary perspective, because it was touted for a long time as an example of evolution in action. And the peppered moth, as you see here, gets its name from its kind of salt and peppered modeled patterning on its design that allows it to hide very beautifully on various forms of trees that have a kind of speckled pattern to them as well. But around the turn of the century, with the Industrial Revolution, when factories are beginning to pump out much more soot, and the trees are then getting covered in this kind of black film from all the soot and the smoke, the peppered moths began to become much more visible on the trees, and so they were much more prone to predation from hungry birds and the like. And so gradually over a series of generations, the peppered moths began to adapt to their environment, as we know species absolutely do, because of the remarkable amount of genetic variability that the father has already programmed into the animal's genetic code. The peppered moths began to take on a darker and darker color because the lighter ones were all dying, and so the darker ones that were surviving were propagating new generations. And so evolutionists were claiming, aha, here's an example of evolution in action, when really all it is just adaptation in action. Certainly natural selection does indeed happen. The ironic thing is that you'd see examples in biology textbooks of peppered moths right on the side of the tree trunks to demonstrate, I thought I had one, to demonstrate a white peppered moth against a black peppered moth to demonstrate how it functioned. Interestingly enough, most of the photos that were put in biology textbooks were actually fraudulent photos because they were literally dead moths glued to a tree. Because more often than not, the peppered moths don't just hang out right on the side of a tree trunk for everyone to see. They actually go up higher into the trees, into the branches, and they hang out on the underside of the branches so that even a bird perched on a tree might not be aware of the fact that it was standing right above one of these moths. But I think that's just a brilliant example of what it takes to try and sell the evolutionary bill of goods is fraudulent photos and misleading information. So the peppered moth is a beautiful example of design in nature, of the father protecting even the least of his creatures against the cursed and fallen world that we currently find ourselves in, and a great example of adaptation, but not evolution. Another incredible creature is the speckled sand dab, and this is a really fascinating little fish because of the progression that it goes through within its life. It actually starts off as a rather normal, I believe, kind of brownish fish whose eyes, he actually has an eye on each side of his head. But as he begins to mature, the fish actually starts to sort of lean to one side, and one of the eyes actually slowly migrates to the other side of the head, which is just amazing, until it has both of the eyes on one side of it, and then for the rest of its life it swims flat like you see here, so that it can swim along the bottom of sandy and pebbled shorelines. And it actually possesses the ability to change its coloring so that it can better blend into whatever environment it finds. So the speckled sand dab has a range of colorings and patterns that it's capable of producing to suit itself, to better acclimate itself to its environment. And then the kind of long filament strands that are projecting off the edge of the fish also just help to kind of further obscure and hide the general outline of the fish. And this kind of frilled edges is something that we actually see used in a number of creatures that employ camouflage. So the speckled sand dab, fascinating little fish creature created by the father. And one animal that is perhaps more familiar to a lot of people is the great horned owl as well. And that was also a graphic on the thumbnail. But the great horned owl as well is a type of predator that has been given the ability to camouflage as well. So it's fascinating to see the father taking care of his creatures on both sides of the predator-prey sort of divide there. The great horned owl can certainly take advantage of its camouflage to make itself less susceptible to being spotted by potential prey. And then, of course, its perfectly soundless flight allows it to swoop in and snatch unsuspecting prey without being detected. But the range of coloration that we see actually in great horned owls is pretty fascinating, because in South America and things like that, where the trees are actually more of a deep reddish kind of color, the great horned owls down there do have a deeper, more kind of chocolatey brown. In the northern territories, as you get up into kind of tundra regions and things like that, great horned owls will have a much wider kind of gray coloration that again allows them to be camouflaged in the snow. And so that alone again provides remarkable examples or remarkable tangible evidence of the wide range of genetic variability that has been pre-programmed into the DNA of these creatures so that they can adapt and thrive in their environments. And again, to suggest that that level of information could have been programmed without purpose and by coincidence is just a ridiculous notion. Probably one of my favorite creatures. I don't know. As I continued to investigate these amazing animals, the video just kept getting longer and longer. But a truly amazing one is what's known as the leaf-tailed gecko, and this is actually a freeze frame screenshot from one of the video segments in the documentary there. But the leaf-tailed geckos, these little critters, are actually designed with this large leaf-like tail that and these guys come in a huge assortment and variety of colors that allow them to blend into their environments. And for the most part, they hang out on sticks and twigs relatively motionless all day, and are most active at night when they go hunting for food. But they can have these, as this little gecko does here, they can have this marvelous kind of dark brown, dry, leafy kind of texture with striations and marks that even look like leaf veins and things. But they can also have skin that resembles the texture and color of tree bark and moss, and just a really wide variety of these. And they also have the ability, like some other lizards, like newts and things, that they can lose their tail to be able to still survive, but they can actually voluntarily shed their tail too, which can, if they're in danger of being spotted by a bird, they can further produce an illusion of just being a leaf by just allowing their tail to fall off, just like a falling leaf, and kind of distract and avoid detection that way as well. Really, really some remarkable little creatures here, the leaf-tailed geckos. The stick insect, no doubt made famous by Bug's Life, but the stick insect is another animal that I think a lot of people are probably familiar with, but is still just an astonishingly beautiful creature when we think about the sophistication involved in making this animal really truly look like a stick.
Michael, you brought some really good memories back of
a
cartoon character carrying around a giant caterpillar.
Right.
Oh man. Some of these pictures that you're showing, they are so similar to like leaves and plants that how could they have evolved to look so similar to like the leaf-tailed gecko that we were looking at? That's just, how does something like that evolve with a tail that looks like a literal leaf? It just, I don't know. It's just very, very cool. Keep telling us more.
So it again, you just keep going back to Romans, because we're the intellectual lightweights, is what the evolutionary supporters will suggest. But again, like you're saying, to look at something like this and then try and actually believe that it was created by nothing. I'm just reminded of Romans professing themselves to be wise. They became fools. It's just foolish to look at something like this and believe that that's how it came about. But one thing about stick insects that I found extremely fascinating that I didn't know about is that their eggs actually look like seeds. And I put together a time lapse. Oh, thanks, buddy. I put together a time lapse video in there of a stick insect actually hatching, and it comes out this thin little tiny green thing. So and as it breaks out of this tiny little black seed, it really looks like a plant sprouting or germinating from a seed. It doesn't look like an animal coming out of an egg. And I just thought, how brilliant for a stick insect to actually look like a plant as it's sprouting. And in fact, there's a wide variety of stick insects. Some of them very small, some of them terrifyingly large. Like some of them are about the size of, I mean, they're about a cubit. They're literally about a cubit, actually, about, elbow to tip of your finger. They're huge. And some of them much more elaborate. But one of them I almost added to the video, but I just didn't want it to get too long. But they actually, their seeds so closely resemble or their eggs so closely resemble a specific type of seed, and I forget right now what seed that is, but this particular seed is the favorite food of a particular species of ant. And so they lay their stick bug eggs in proximity to these ant hills, and the ants will actually grab the eggs thinking that they're seeds and take them down into their ant colonies, where they kind of bury them and store them away in a nice cool dry place, thus taking care of the eggs unwittingly, only for later the bugs to hatch out and actually feed on some of the ants as they make their way to the surface. So a fascinating symbiotic relationship where these two animals have developed a relationship, one which the stick bug is very aware of and the ants are not. That was really compelling to me as well. The walking leaf, this is another one. You would talk about something that looks pretty believable. The walking leaf is another type of creature where there are a wide variety of these, and their appearance in terms of looking like a true leaf is just practically perfect. And what's even more remarkable is that a number of these, as you can kind of see in the example on the right, a number of these species will actually grow irregular edges, and those edges will sometimes have little brown spots and things that perfectly mimic, leaf decay or insect damage, so that it just looks like any other leaf sitting there that's maybe been nibbled on by a caterpillar, or it's just starting to dry out and wither away. Even their legs and appendages. You see in the example on the left, the leaf that this insect is standing on and the kind of horizontal ribs of the leaf, mimicked so beautifully in the main part of the leaf insect's abdomen. And a lot of these animals as well, the way in which they move, and you can see this in the video, they have this kind of stutter step, like back and forth kind of wobble that they do, that beautifully mimics leaves being blown in the wind. So even when they're moving, their movements are choreographed in such a way to make the camouflage that much more deceptive. Truly remarkable animals here. Now, the orchid mantis, this was very interesting because I've seen lots of pictures of orchid mantis before, and actually for decades, even scientists had it all wrong about the orchid mantis, that we would look at this creature and we see its very delicate coloring of pinks and whites and purples, and how closely it actually resembles the colorings of orchids. And so it was falsely assumed that these creatures would position themselves on orchids so that when bees and other pollen-seeking insects would come to the orchid, that the mantis could then pounce on them for food. But there's been a recent study by a researcher. Again, I don't have notes in front of me here. I apologize. His name escapes me. But a recent researcher had done some really in-depth studies with orchid mantises in a controlled kind of environment where they were placing some mantises on orchids, even though we've come to discover that they don't ever really position themselves like this. When we see photos like this, it's because a photographer has put them on an orchid to take a compelling photo. But in their natural environment, following their own natural instincts, orchid mantises more traditionally position themselves near flowers, like in the proximity of flowers, but actually on, sticks or vines or stems themselves, adjacent to a flower, but not actually on the flower. And they discovered that pollen-seeking insects actually approached the mantis themselves more often than they approached the actual flower. And that's because when you look at an orchid mantis from above, it actually resembles, it has a striking resemblance to just a generic flower shape in general. And so they refer to this as aggressive predation, which means that the mantises themselves so closely resemble a flower that dinner just comes to them. So all they have to do is position themselves, near a flower, and then just be still and wait for an insect to come on over, and they just grab them and start munching down. And I thought that was extraordinary. That made it even more remarkable in my mind that it's not just that they look like an orchid and hide out on an orchid. They are so compellingly designed that to an insect, they truly believe they're a flower, and they actually approach them more often than real flowers. I thought that was stunning. Moving on here, the pygmy seahorse. This is also a relatively new creature. And I like this particular shot because it helps give you a sense of scale, as that is a person's finger pointing to actually two, I believe, no, it is just one, to one pygmy seahorse there in the very center of the photo. And the pygmy seahorse was only recently discovered. I think it's been, it's in the last 18 years. It's been in the 2000s, I'm pretty sure. And they were actually discovered by accident when some species of this specific type of fan coral was harvested from the ocean and brought into, aquariums, placed into saltwater aquariums. And it wasn't until after that point that they realized, oh my goodness, there's a tiny little seahorse on this thing. And it turned out to be a new species of seahorse that we were previously unaware of. And the adult males, again, they're only about the size of a fingernail or about 2 grains of rice. So, I mean, they're remarkably tiny little critters. But here's another shot of them so you can appreciate just how stinking cute they are at the same time. And they live only on this one very specific type of sea fan coral, although they can come in a range of colors, oranges and purples as well. But their body develops these little tubercles all over that as you can see, blend in beautifully with that particular type of coral that they live on. So another example of a very strong symbiotic relationship between two living forms of life, between this plant and this animal. And they're so tiny, in fact, that they spend their entire life just clinging to these corals. They will kind of drift around a little bit and grab onto different branches, but they're far too tiny to handle the ocean current. So they just hang out here their whole life and slurp up smaller prey, or smaller little forms of sea debris. But the scientists also began to study them because when they're first born, and there's some great footage of the birth of some of these seahorses now being documented in the video. They actually come out as just tiny little brown seahorses, and then depending upon the type of coral that they find themselves on, they will take on that particular color So much so that scientists had a particular species of the pygmy seahorse that was purple, and they harvested the babies right after they were born, and then placed them into an aquarium with a very bright orange coral. And sure enough, as these young ones developed and matured, they took on the color of the orange coral, even though they were only one generation removed from very bright purple seahorses. So again, just a remarkable example of this genetic variability, and the kind of genetic fluidity that we see present in these living creatures that the Father has provided for them to be a protection. The chameleon. Chameleon was another one that I thought just had to make it into the video. And then as I started researching it, was again stunned to find out that only recently have we discovered that we had it all wrong with chameleons. Everyone fancies them or seems to understand that chameleons will change their color to adapt to their environment. And there is certainly no shortage of chameleon videos on YouTube that are falsified and bogus, and you'll see examples of them climbing onto different colors of sunglasses, and then they just almost immediately change to that color, and all of that's bogus and fake. We've actually come to find out that chameleons at rest naturally have variegated green colors like you see here in the picture. So when they are calm and at rest and not in any threat of danger, they're naturally camouflaged for a green environment, which makes sense because that's where they spend most of their life. It's only when they are excited or agitated or aroused, in mating ceremonies and the like, that they then begin to take on this myriad of colors. And they certainly are capable of a wide variety of remarkable colors and patterns and things. But the way in which they achieve these colors is what scientists have really marveled at, that they have this very complex system of crystals. Actually, they're a type of salt crystal, essentially, that's just beneath their skin. And they actually have 2 layers of these salt crystals, and they can control the proximity of these crystals. They're in this kind of this matrix, or this sort of fabric-like mesh, these salt crystals, and through muscle contractions, they can adjust how close or far apart these crystals are. And that's just like a regular prism or crystal with light, that adjusts and changes how light is then refracted through their skin. And then that lower batch of crystals actually absorbs heat. So the top layer is refracting light as they contract and expand this lattice-like structure of crystals. And then the layer just beneath that absorbs the heat to help them regulate their body temperature, because they are cold-blooded animals. And so it's a far more complicated system than we ever imagined. We sort of assumed that it was something like we see in squid and octopus and things, where they have the ink sacs. We'll actually talk about that later, but we've only recently begun to discover that this kind of salt crystal-like lattice thing that they've got going on under their skin is blowing scientists' minds. And already there is talk about how that could maybe be adapted into human technology for various applications of color changing clothing and things like that too. And I think that, while I distract myself for a minute, is another brilliant point, and you might have some thoughts on this, Jake. Another brilliant point about design and nature is how many human technology, how many examples of human technology we have that are derived from the natural world. So we learn more about how to make more sophisticated machines and technology and devices from the natural world, and yet the natural world is supposed to be a byproduct of random chance and circumstance. That's never made any sense to me at all. And they attribute it, of course, to just Mother Nature. We learned so much from Mother Nature, but I don't know if you had any thoughts there to share.
I can only imagine the type of technology that that is only possible because they've tapped into the surrounding creation. They've tapped into how some of these animals operate, how some of I forget who it is based the design of certain stealth fighter jets off of particular birds and the way that their beaks are formed that helps them pierce through. Oh, no, it was the I'm sure with airplanes too there's a case, but it was the bullet train in Japan that the creator had to figure out, how can we stop this from creating the supersonic boom as it's going through residential areas? And he actually tapped into some local species of birds, and they actually based the design off of the bullet train in Japan after the way that these birds' beaks were kind of formed and angled, and it solved the issue. And so for this in particular, with like the chameleons and camouflage, I can only imagine the cool stuff they have down in some kind of underground laboratory,
right?
Off of these concepts. And it's freaky to think about if you know what kind of government, how they're going to implement these and use them. But it would be so awesome to get my hands on some kind of like invisibility cloak or something.
There you go, right?
Like that.
That's another show.
Oh, yeah.
But the examples of like I know the blue morpho butterfly that a lot of people are familiar of. That they've studied that, and their wings have actually inspired a new version of solar panels that have a greater efficiency at being able to absorb light. I mean, there's countless examples where we see the design that we find in nature inspiring new technology in humans. Here's another fun little critter that I couldn't help but add into the video. It's actually the spice bush swallowtail caterpillar. And this little critter, he's a tiny little caterpillar actually, who resembles obviously a snake. And when these guys are in their feeding cycles, they typically will actually roll themselves. They'll get into the center of a leaf and then roll the leaf around them into kind of a tube-like shape so that they can kind of hide and eat in privacy. But if a bird were to unwittingly poke his head into this tube, he finds himself staring straight into the large eyes of a snake. And it actually resembles very closely a species of snake called the vine snake. But you've got these bright yellow eye spots with the black pupils and even little white spots that sort of look like light refracting or light reflecting on the wet eye. And then even more fascinating is that this little caterpillar has some defense mechanisms where if it is threatened, it will raise its head and deploy these what are essentially inflatable antennae. And you can see those starting to be deployed there on the right, inflatable antennae that are actually look very much like a bifurcated snake tongue. And then they also release a very strong pungent odor, because these particular caterpillars live almost exclusively on the sassafras plant. And so which kind of has a strong aroma anyway. And so they release this concentrated dose of sassafras aroma and deploy this little bifurcated tongue, and that just completes the snake illusion, which will repel any predators, or that is the hope. And I was surprised to find there's actually quite a few caterpillars that will actually use snake-like camouflage or mimicry. And as I got to thinking about it, that implies, again, a whole nother aspect of design, because when it's one thing to camouflage, but when you are mimicking another species, you have to know what that species looks like. You have to know how that species behaves. And then the decoration on the animal has to be accurate enough that it's going to elicit a psychological reaction in the mind of their would-be attacker. I mean, it has to be convincing enough to essentially trigger the fight or flight syndrome to cause the predator to want to escape. And how do you account for that from a Darwinian perspective? That a design so closely mimics that of a creature that is the predator of your predator, right? The enemy of my enemy is my friend. That how do you account for a natural process that creates the illusion of a predator for your would-be predator that is so convincing that it elicits a psychological response?
Yeah, this is so
that's
crazy.
Really compelling.
I mean, how does that caterpillar know that if it looks like another creature entirely, what if this caterpillar doesn't live anywhere near a snake? And they're born and they live out these lives masquerading as snakes. And there's, I don't think these caterpillars are super smart. I mean,
yeah, that's just it. They don't know they look like a snake. They're just acting upon their biological instinct. They're not even aware that they're mimicking a snake. That's just how God has provided for them. They also have a very nice mustache, I must say, too, if you notice there right at the end.
And of course, you have to kind of assume that, these creatures, somebody who created these creatures intended it for it to look this way with the mindset of, I'm going to create another creature that's going to freak out these birds.
Right.
But without the puzzle pieces all being put into place, just, it's mind-blowing. How can they not see this? How can somebody not look at the creation and declare the glory of God? Because it absolutely demonstrates that he foresaw that bird was going to get freaked out by a snake-looking caterpillar, and that caterpillar was going to be, like, wow.
Yeah. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Indeed. Here's another example of that. It's actually called the hawk-mouth caterpillar. And interestingly enough, this is the hindquarters of this particular caterpillar. And so when it is threatened, it will actually inflate its posterior region there, right? He gets some junk in his trunk. It actually inflates its backside there. And that's where you get these pronounced eye spots. And it ridges out, like the brow of this this snake. And then it will actually, while it's hanging on to the branch with its front legs, it will sway its back regions kind of back and forth, again, in movements that very closely resemble that of a snake head, rooting around in these plants as well. And I've got, again, some great video footage of this particular caterpillar in there as well. And they're not terribly big. So, the photos can be a little deceptive. They're smaller than you might think in this photo, but it's still an incredibly effective illusion that they are, in fact, a predator when they are indeed prey. But this video here, and I'm going to kind of let this play out, this video is actually what inspired this whole design and nature idea. And this is actually the sort of third generation of this video that I've done, because as I've continued to investigate the idea, I just had to keep adding more to it. And maybe some of you have seen this online. It's definitely made its rounds. And it is by a marine biologist name. I believe his name is Robert Hansen or Richard Hansen. I do credit him in the video, so I apologize if I'm getting that wrong. And for anyone that hasn't seen this, I don't want to spoil it, but we're just going to play this out here for a second, and then we'll discuss it. But he is swimming up on this coral here, and then watch what happens. Look at that. And then this octopus swims away and inks him, and he chases the octopus for a bit, and then the octopus immediately, in the full-length video that you can find online, the octopus immediately begins to spread his body out very wide, so he tries and looks larger than he is, and he begins flashing many different colors to try and spook it. But it plays the video back here in slow motion, and I want you to appreciate what's happening. This octopus is changing its color, it's changing its texture, it's changing the pattern, and it's doing all of this in a matter of seconds until it is perfectly hidden into this coral. And the octopus actually has complete control, apparently, we're discovering, over this. It is not an autonomous reaction. We're finding, or scientists are finding, that octopus actually do much of this by sight and by touch. So they're seeing and feeling the object upon which they are hiding. And I'm just going to let you play this again because it just blows my mind every time. And they're able to almost instantaneously change the entire color, shape, pattern, configuration of their body to create such a perfect camouflage. Easily my favorite form of animal camouflage and mimicry. And again, octopus, in fact, all the cephalopods, we only continue to marvel at the ways in which they can camouflage themselves. And in fact, they do employ, and in the video I've got quite a few clips of octopus, and cuttlefish are another one, and squid. Great close-up shots of their skin. And their skin, they employ these chromatophores is what they're called. And they're essentially little ink-filled sacs that are extremely elastic. And they can, again, in a way similar to the chameleon, they can expand and contract the size of these little ink-filled sacs to manipulate the color that they are pigmenting. And then they also have specialized skin cells that they can adjust to change the texture of their skin. So they can poke them up or push them down to manipulate the texture of their skin. And so it's just remarkable, marvelous examples of aesthetic design in nature, or artistic design. And so here's where these two concepts of design, there's another level here, in the complexity of engineering that we discussed in the beginning, and the beauty of the camouflage and mimicry are actually interconnected, because all of these animals and countless others like them are incredibly exciting evidence for the existence of God, because they beautifully exhibit design from an artistic sense of the word. So we can see evidence for God when we acknowledge the design of these animals from an aesthetic standpoint, meaning how they look. Paintings are aesthetic objects, meaning they're objects that are designed to be looked at. So when we appreciate how they look, especially, again, like this boa constrictor on this leaf-littered floor, in comparison to their natural environment, the design is simply implicit. In fact, the way in which they utilize camouflage or mimicry demonstrates artistic design in an absolutely indisputable fashion. And I'll prove it here with a great quote. What you're seeing in the image is a frogfish, or what's also known as sometimes as an anglerfish. Well, no, I take that back. I think the anglerfish is different, but the frogfish and the anglerfish are related. But the frogfish has a lightning fast ability to quickly expand its mouth and snarf up things swimming by, quite large, whole fish. And it looks very similar to this particular species of coral. So much so that some people have a hard time figuring out which is the fish and which is the coral. The fish is on the left. You can see his mouth open just a little bit there. But this is a great quote that I found specifically about the frogfish. It says, "The unusual appearance of the frogfish is designed to conceal it from predators, and sometimes to mimic a potential meal to its prey. What's fascinating to me is I found this quote mentioning how frogfish are designed on, of all places, a website called whyevolutionIstrue.wordpress.com. I thought that was fantastic. I was just
Wow.
Even the
They
evolutionists
just put it out there right in front of you.
They cannot help but acknowledge that, this is clearly designed. But instead, you'll hear all of the time from people like Richard Dawkins and others, and even like in the Google definition, the phrase "the appearance of design." Excuse me. So they won't actually credit it as being designed, but it does have the appearance of design. But the way in which these animals perfectly match colors, textures, and shapes and patterns, it simply cannot be accounted for from a naturalistic perspective. This is another example of those leaf-tailed geckos. And so you can see how this is how they often are during the day. They'll lay prone very, very close to the surface of the branch to minimize the shadow. And you'll notice they too often have the kind of frilled edges along the outsides of their body, which helps break up the outline of the lizard as they lay flat, and helps them to better blend into the the leaves and branches upon which they're hiding. But here's the thing: this could not just happen by chance. When we look at creatures like this is an example of the barren caterpillar, which grows into the barren butterfly, or the barren, I think it's perhaps a moth. This is actually its caterpillar-like state. I mean, look at that, Jake. And it has...
You know what that looks like? It looks like somebody had some kind of lens distortion when they took a picture of a leaf.
Right? It's got these really, really kind of frilly, like they look like fronds on a fern or something. And this one is actually backwards, where you'll notice the angles of his legs are actually going kind of contrary to the angles of the veins in the leaf. It's even more deceptive when they get themselves on the leaf the right way around. They're all but invisible. And then this grows into a, once it pupates and goes through the chrysalis form, it grows into a very, pretty kind of brownish and black moth. But interestingly enough, if you weren't aware of this, most caterpillars, once they enter the chrysalis stage, they actually are liquefied. And if, again, if that doesn't just blow your mind, that they, instinctually form this cocoon, go into an ultra hibernation kind of state. Their bodies are actually liquefied and turned into soup, and then rearrange themselves into a species that has a whole new mode of operation. Then they become this beautifully designed winged insect that is then going to become pollen seeking instead of plant eating. It's remarkable. So this could not just happen by chance. And if there is a reason for something, and we know that there is reason implicit in all of these, animals are camouflaged to keep them from being eaten, or animals are camouflaged to make it more easy to eat other animals. So if there is a reason for something, then there is also a purpose. And that unfolds a new layer in all of this, because purpose does not and could not simply arise from undirected, random, natural processes. Because, again, inherently, the whole idea, the whole concept of evolution is that it's supposed to be purposeless. It is just happening, is just unfolding, following the natural laws, which it's weird that there's so many natural laws if it's all random, but it is a purposeless process. So how could it produce something that has purpose? And there is an inherent intentionality in having one object look like another object. even more so when we stop and think about that these objects are living organisms that grow and change over their lifespan. That was something else that really struck me as I began to really think about this and unpack it. Here in this example is the long spinnered bark spider, and it lives primarily on tree bark because, as you can see, its natural patterning and coloring makes it almost undetectable on a tree. And these guys can range in size from about the size of your palm to about the size of your whole hand, including your fingers. So that's fun for those with arachnophobia. But when you think about the fact that this spider, excuse me, the spider begins as an egg that has to go through developmental changes and grow into maturity to become this particular creature. And the tree which it lives on starts as a seed and has to go through its own developmental changes so that they can both eventually meet in the middle and look the same. That's an extraordinary turn of events to happen just by coincidence. And we see this with, this is something we have to take into account with every single example of animal camouflage, that they are eventually arriving into an adult stage of development resembling another form of life that also has had to go through a process of change and growth so that they would both end up looking the same at essentially the same time. And achieving this is not easy. Making one object look like another object is not an easy thing to accomplish. You can ask any beginning art student this. And here's an example of the owl moth, aptly named because the eye spots that it has on its wings there. And so whether they are paired up together like this, or they can unfold both of their wings and display two eye spots themselves. But when they hang upside down from tree branches like this, and you're looking through, a thick foliage of a tree, and you are a predator and you see these two eye spots staring back at you, you're gonna get out of there. And so again, we have to think about the fact that being able to perfectly simulate another existing object is inherently an artistic task. This is the work of an artist. And it takes skill and intelligence to know how to eloquently shape a form to resemble another pre-existing form, like we see here with this katydid, which often have remarkable leaf-like camouflage. And I think, I'm sorry, this slide is out of order here as we were talking about purpose, but these are example of leaf litter toads that hang out on the ground of rainforest and things, and they come in a wide variety of colors and patterns, and they just look like all the other leaves littering the jungle floor. But the point about being an artist, it takes skill and intelligence to match the subtle nuances and shades of a very specific color. If anyone out there has ever tried to mix paint to match a color, you'll know how tricky that can be at times. And when you're thinking about a living biological creature like this katydid, another example of a katydid, so perfectly matching the colors of this decaying leaf where it finds its environment, again, that's a stunning example of artistic design that doesn't just happen. It takes skill and intelligence. It also takes skill and intelligence to compose sophisticated patterns that duplicate the results of light and shadow, especially when you're working with textured organic surfaces. Much less on a flat piece of paper, but even more complex when you're talking about the skin of a three-dimensional organism. It takes an artist to do these things with such expert precision. And again, the accomplishment of these designs becomes even more stunning and impressive when you remember that to effect these changes requires billions of chemical and genetic sequences to be executed perfectly on a microscopic scale. That's how the Father is painting these creatures, is with the genetic complexity that we addressed in the beginning of the video. All of this marvelously tiny infinitesimal cellular machines are what are ultimately forming these beautifully interwoven patterns and colors and textures that allow these animals to be camouflaged. So we've looked at design from an engineering perspective, and we've looked at design from an artistic perspective, and we realize that actually these two things work interdependently, or interconnectedly, to achieve this. And again, clearly these types of things don't just happen. And so it all causes us to recognize that clearly these animals speak volumes about the wisdom, power, and creativity of our God. And as we've mentioned a number of times, it makes me think of Romans 1:20, for his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made. Or Psalms 140:24, O Lord, how manifold are your works, in wisdom have you made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. In Job 12, we hear, but ask the beasts, and they will teach you, the birds of the heavens, and they will tell you, or the bushes of the earth, and they will teach you, and the fish of the sea will declare to you. Who among all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? In his hand is the life of every living thing and the breath of all mankind. For you are great, says Psalm 86, and do wondrous things. You alone are God. And that's what I've got for you guys tonight.
Wow. Incredible presentation, Michael. That just, I love looking at creation and just the majesty of what God's put together for us here to enjoy and to look at and just ponder, and I think this presentation really brings that out in a very vivid visual way for our audience. So thank you for putting that together.
Man, my pleasure. And that's, the focus of Creation Club has always been to try and encourage believers and strengthen their faith. And the enemy is working overtime at producing all forms of media that are meant to take our eyes off of God, that are meant to convince us that all of this could happen outside of God, and that are meant to make us feel foolish for wanting to believe in God. But, all of this is in vain when you just step outside and set your eyes on anything that the Lord has made, contemplate that, recognize what it is. And again, when we start to think about a single tree, that's actually one of the teachings that I've got on my to-do list is the fascinating topic of seeds, and how a single tiny little seed has all the information needed to produce these structures, hundreds of feet tall, that are become oxygen factories for us so that we can breathe and they can absorb our outgassing poison. I mean, it's fascinating. It only takes but a few minutes to realize how just amazing and marvelous every single thing he's made is. And that should stir up just worship in your heart, and allow you to just keep your eyes fixed on the Father in spite of this dark and sinful world that we currently find ourselves living in.
Absolutely. Now, we didn't have any questions written in particular. We were all in absorption mode, I think. But I really want to just tell you, Michael, how much we appreciate you. And I know people can find Michael's Creation Club videos on nystv.org. If you use the promo Creation Club, that's helps support Michael and some of the videos that he's been taking a lot of time to put together to go through these topics and really break them down in a great way. A lot of really awesome resources that we would love for you guys to check out and to help support Michael and nystv.org by joining up with the subscription site. Just, once again, thank you for coming on to Now You See TV, Michael. It's always good to have you back.
And my pleasure. I appreciate the opportunity. Partnering with Now You See TV, you guys allow me to have an audience far bigger than I could ever garner for myself. And so I pray that it's a blessing for everyone, and I hope you check out more.
Awesome. Well, thank you everybody for tuning in to Now You See TV. Until next time, everybody, shalom. We'll do the high five.